We were saying earlier, Kirsten has been working on this amazing book, Times of Health and Conscientiousness, by the Spirit Joanna de Angelis. And tonight we will be receiving another hour and a half of joy, where Kirsten will be sharing chapter 20, that is entitled Psychological Maturity. I know we're all mature here, but we have our downfalls, right? Sometimes we have our moments that we act immaturely. So Kirsten is sharing with us tonight, this afternoon into this evening, as I like to say, this psychological maturity and what Joanna D'Angelo has to say about it. So we open up not only for us here later on, but for those who are following us on the web as well, to share your comments, your questions. And if you are following us, and Kirsten, if you want to please remind all of those who are, which I forget all the time, to make sure that we put the likes, that we share this with others as well. As we share, the message gets to be multiplied out there, right? So it's a good reminder for all of us to do that as well. Even if we can go back later on and share as well this moment, because it brings the message to another level. So thank you, Kirsten. With no further ado, it's all yours.
Wow, good evening. I was trying to think of the time. It's still kind of, sun is still shining for us over here, but wherever you are, hello, thank you for joining us. And my apologies for not being able to be there in person. I miss every single one of you. I love to be in person, but there were some things going on that impeded us from being there in person today. As Leo said, everyone who's watching this is psychologically mature. Like this isn't, this isn't even, we all know this material, we could probably recite it back and forth. Perhaps. Or perhaps we could say we have our moments, where we feel like we have it all together, and then there are moments that humble us and remind us that, oh, I guess I'm not that mature as I thought I was. Sometimes there are parts of us that still need to be worked on and worked through, and quite frankly, just need room to grow. And that is the same for everybody. No one is independent from this. There's no exception to this rule in God's creation. We all go through and have to go through and reach psychological maturity. But today, in chapter 20 of this book, we're going to talk about psychological maturity from a broad sense. We can always take hours to break down the different terminologies and Joanna's works, but because our meeting here, our talk is just 1 hour, we kind of wanted to group together this overall understanding of what psychological maturity is. And we're going to get into that definition just to help level set for us for this talk today. But Joanna is very unique in this book, and you all who have been following this series and have watched the prior videos or even read this book know that she has a set of affirmations before every chapter that are almost always pertaining to that particular chapter and what we are about to dive into. So it's kind of like, getting your mind ready. Sometimes before you go into the gym, you might listen to some music to pump you up, or, before you have to go for a really difficult meeting, you just kind of have to get into this certain mindset. You give yourself a pep talk. It's kind of how I view, in a sense, these affirmations. It's getting us ready to receive these messages from Joanna, from these higher minds, from this book, from these spiritist ideas and ideals. So it's like fine-tuning an instrument. If any of you ever played an instrument, a piano, I used to play violin, some of you play guitar, you're fine-tuning it first. So that's what we want to do. We want to fine-tune our minds, our hearts, because some of you might have had a very stressful week, or it might have been even a stressful month, or maybe it just was a stressful day. Who knows? But let us all kind of come together in this moment. And I'm going to read the words we are going to read the words stated by Joanna in the beginning of chapter 20, there, before the chapter starts. And if you want to, I encourage you and welcome you to close your eyes during this moment, just to help with this meditative moment. Sometimes closing our eyes can help us achieve that. If not, feel free to leave your eyes open. Joanna says the following, and you can repeat it in your mind as I read it. Divine balance keeps me in harmony. I go within to know myself. I go outside myself to be useful. I must be generous toward myself, others, and life. I must be generous toward myself, others, and life. Divine balance has touched me gently, like springtime shedding dew on the rosebud, and it has made me blossom fully. These beautiful words remind us to travel inside of ourselves, especially this evening. Let us try to do that. So as we are sharing the words from Joanna, let us be reminded that they're not our own. They're not our, although we follow, we believe it, they're not our own words, but that come from this enlightened, mediumistic work of love and enlightenment. But before we jump right into that, I think it's important. We think it's important that we level set, so we all are kind of on the same page of when we're talking about psychological maturity. What are we referring to? Because you could say, well, there's psychological maturity, Kirsten, and then some might say there's emotional maturity, and other different types of maturity. But for the sake of our conversation, we kind of want to just to lay it out there. So, from the American Psychological Association, they define psychological maturity as the ability to deal effectively and resiliently with experience and to perform satisfactorily in developmental tasks, whether they're biological, social, or cognitive, characteristic of one's age level. But for the sake of this conversation today, we're going to think of psychological maturity and we're going to place it into the same umbrella or the same boat or under the same umbrella for now as emotional maturity, mental maturity, or personal maturity, just to help us grasp the idea of what this is. So when we talk about psychological maturity, if you hear us intertwine using words like emotional maturity, we're talking about the same thing, just for the sake of this conversation and for the sake of this particular presentation. So a famous quote by, or rather just a quote, I don't know how famous it is, a famous quote by Carl Jung. Many of you already know who he is, a famous theorist and someone that Joanna quotes a lot in the field of psychology. He said, the achievement of psychological maturity is an individual task, and so is increasingly difficult today when man's individuality is threatened by widespread conformity. I'm going to read that again. The achievement of psychological maturity is an individual task, and so is increasingly difficult today when man's individuality is threatened by widespread conformity. Now, when Jung said this so many years and a few decades ago, you might say, well, society looked very different back then. It really hadn't. It has changed, but in many ways, it's still similar in the ways in which we behave. We tend to mimic others, or we tend to conform, especially in a social setting. And there's a whole other psychological reasoning behind that. But for the sake of this conversation and not wanting to dive into the next 3 hours into this, sometimes this happens. We lose our ability to be authentic because we are afraid to be who we are. And that would mark a sign of someone that is still yet psychologically immature, when we cannot yet feel safe enough in our own self to not have to conform to what the populace is saying. But more to come on that. Psychological maturity from Joanna. She says the following: the interpersonal relationship reveals people's behavior in relation to themselves and others. In early attempts, individuals hide their reality in the great preoccupation with appearance. So, how we are with others reveals our relation with ourselves as well as with others. This is the interpersonal relationship. And oftentimes, Joanna says, we are, let me go back one. We have masks. We hide because we're worried how we come off to others. She goes on to say, but as connections narrow, people's caution gives way to emotional relaxation, and little by little the mask falls. So it's almost a normal progression in a sense. Normal in the sense that this law of self-preservation, we have that within us in a psychological sense. We wish to preserve out of fear ourselves. So instead of revealing and being authentic from the get-go, we oftentimes either have a mask, sometimes that's portrayed as a persona. We have certain personas at work, and then at home, and then perhaps if we're doing another activity. But oftentimes there's this mask because we're afraid. But slowly but surely, as we get to know others, we let down our guard, get more comfortable, and allow those so-called masks to fall away. And this phenomenon, Joanna says, results from the closeness that time provides the relationship. And that is something that we don't always give a chance to blossom in relationship, is to give time for us to mature, to grow. But so we're on the same page and understanding what interpersonal relationships are, is to understand what is interpersonal communication. It's defined as the process by which people exchange information, feelings, and meaning through verbal and nonverbal messages. It is face-to-face communication. Something for us to think about. She goes on to say the following. Oh, sorry. She doesn't go on to say the following. We wanted to add this in here, as Joanna talks about this. As connections narrow, people's caution gives way to emotional relaxation, and our masks fall away, and that this results from closeness. This leads us to have more vulnerability in our relationships. And this is also an aspect of psychological maturity, emotional maturity. Again, remember, we're lumping all those into one umbrella. So it allows us to have these closer bonds, breaking down these walls, invites us to be more honest, open space, make space for open communication, and embraces authenticity. These are all the benefits. And we as human beings, we all crave this. It's funny how we are in a sense, right? Because we put up walls and we put up all these protective barriers. So many of us do this, sometimes even unconsciously. We can see this a lot in teenagers, in high schools. If you go and observe crowds of teenagers and the interpersonal relationships, you can see this, each one conforming to the other because everyone's afraid to be who they are authentically. But when a few people are able to get to know each other, grow a closer bond, their walls break down, they feel that they're in a safer space, we're able to open up communication, and they each can be more authentic. But if we never look at ourselves, if we never stop to look at ourselves, we will never have this. I shouldn't say never. We will prolong happiness because the law of progress says eventually we're going to get there. But we're going to prolong our own personal suffering by not being more introspective. Joanna goes on and she says, the conduct of healthy, accomplished people holds no surprises because there is an interaction between their inner and outer lives. True psychological maturity. So it's knowing ourselves from the inside out and being able to manage those different worlds. What's going internally, what's happening externally, and managing them in a balanced way. Joanna goes on to say, after self-awareness, which brings about self-acceptance, the outer is explored and new and enriching experiences are welcome. We are less afraid to travel around the world, so to speak, the world around us. It doesn't necessarily mean the physical earth in and of itself, but just to live. We will not be as afraid. Once we have more self-awareness, self-acceptance, we can easily be with a crowd of people or in a social setting or be out and not be afraid to be our authentic self and not be afraid to have experiences in life. How many times have we known ourselves to be fearful? Again, maybe we're not even aware of it at times. So we seclude ourselves or we don't allow ourselves to go and experience life. Always in a balanced way. We're never ever talking about something that is could be potentially harmful or detrimental to us or anyone else for that matter. Joanna goes on to say that balance marks the personality, and there are no eccentricities or abrupt changes, as is the case between elation and depression. Such individuals have attained plenitude, radiating this human achievement all around. Balance is the mark of someone that is psychologically mature. And when we think about immature people, again, we're using the easiest example and the most tangible because we've all gone through our teenage years, is sometimes when we're a teenager and we just make sometimes drastic decisions. We decide to go and dye our hair blue, or we, tattoo something, or we might pierce something, or, one day you just decide to, well, you want to be this, well, now I want to be this, and then go back to something else. And you kind of flip-flop all the time because you're in that process of still getting to know yourself. It's not to say that all teenagers are just terrible. No. In as much as we can say adults that are still going through this level of psychologically immature are not terrible people. We all have aspects of this that we are still working on to be more psychologically mature. This is not Joanna's attempt to make us hate ourselves or to point fingers at others. This is not an attempt to throw stones. So you might think, why is she letting us know about this? She's just telling us what it is, but why? Because she wants us to be free. She wants us to be and experience that joy, that freedom that comes with being able to be psychologically mature, being able to be authentic, to be aligned with goodness and virtues. Because ultimately, we can see that as we become more psychologically mature, we're able to understand others, even if they are bad to us, if they treat us wrong, but yet we're still able to react in such a way to look at them as someone that is ill, for instance. Whereas someone who may be psychologically still immature, perhaps in some ways, instead of acting, we react. When someone steps on our foot, we want to slap them. It's almost a knee-jerk reaction. It's so ingrained in us. But at some point, as we evolve and become more mature, and that happens not just because time just passes, it happens because we make that effort. We go through different experiences. And oftentimes those experiences are hardships, challenges, difficulties, the ones that we all hate to go through, wish we didn't have. But it is a tool for us to become wiser. Joanna goes on to say, in the alternate behavior, meaning opposite from someone that is psychologically mature, where joy and sorrow, trust and suspicion, love and animosity are mixed together, immaturity and a lack of self-discovery foster states of instability and misery, leading to somatic emotional disorders that surface destructively in the body. When we have these issues within us, these inner dichotomies, if you will, joy and sorrow, trust, yet there's suspicion, love, yet animosity, all mixed up together, and a lack of self-discovery can foster instability and misery, leading to somatic emotional disorders. What is somatic? It means in the body. And they will surface, Joanna says, destructively in the body. So this is not only psychological immaturity, is not only perhaps an annoyance for others in our lives, but it is a detriment to our physical health, which begs the question, well, then what do we do? How do I become psychologically mature? Self-discovery, getting to know ourselves. And that might seem so redundant or it's been repeated a lot. but it needs to be. Because there's something incredibly magical. Yes, I said magical. And I'm not talking about Harry Potter magic. This isn't, Hogwarts, okay? We're talking about the magic because we lack the words to define what happens when we truly take the steps to get to know our inner selves. And I say selves, plural, because there's so many different parts to us. But when we do that work, it's magical because you begin to change. And oftentimes when we think about changing, and we think about, inner transformation, sometimes we might have this other type of magical thinking where we think, well, I'll do X and then spontaneously everything will be better. And sometimes we're looking for some big thing to do. Well, let me go into this, or let me go do this or that. When really it's just diligently over time, investing time in yourself to get to know the different parts of who you are, to love them, to show compassion towards yourself, to reverse even these somatic emotional disorders. And this has already been proven in a lot of areas of science. We know that when people experience anxiety and depression, they feel it physically in their body. They have headaches, they have body pains, all different other types of illnesses and disorders can occur. So it behooves us. It's for our own benefit to work on being the best version of ourselves. Joanna goes on to say, in a relationship, such reflections generate imbalances that worsen and become disastrous, pushing their victims into obsessive, compulsive, or depressive states. Let's think about that. When we have this jumble of different emotions or feelings, and it makes us unstable, and we begin to feel miserable, this opens us up as well to obsessive processes of a great variety, and can put us into these depressive states. She says, in your quest for growth, get a feel for the conflict between your inner and outer reality. Here, Joanna is peeling back the onion. If you want to begin this quest for inner growth, you need to sort of, if you can imagine, opening up sort of an internal radar system and ask yourself, let's say, for example, if there is a conflict, as Joanna mentions here, getting a feeling for this conflict, how I feel internally and the outer reality of it. And she says, do not become upset with reactive people who are angry at themselves and spew their foul mood at others. Now, this can happen, what she's describing here, in a moment. You could be at the grocery store and someone bumps their cart into you, and before you can even open your mouth to say anything, the person starts screaming at you, perhaps yelling obscenities and saying a lot of unpleasant things. And in that moment, you can react. Of course, it's a, normal reaction, one might think, or common, I should say, not normal per se, but you would react. Perhaps you would say something directly back saying, oh, well, it was your fault. You bumped into me. But if in that moment, we can take a second inside of ourselves to look at the situation from a bird's eye view and think to yourself, wait a second, maybe this person just got some really bad news. Maybe this person is just a miserable person because they don't know how to be any different. They're in that phase of their life where they're struggling. And so they externalize their pain onto others. So I either can join in on this person's misery and add to it and add to mine, or I can, in that moment, show compassion. And we call that disarming other people. So instead of reacting like, how could you do that? You can say, you know what, man? Totally sorry. I hope you have an awesome day. And you will find often that it takes people back because it immediately disarms them. She goes on to say, be courteous so that your bilious state does not dictate your behavior. In your turn, do not become such a personality yourself, always reacting when you should and could act. So let us be self-aware so we don't spew our issues onto others, even if we feel them. But let us try our best to not hurt others when we are hurting. As the saying goes, hurt people, hurt people. Did you get it? Hurt people, hurt people. So let us try to be more conscientious in the ways in which we act. And one really important way to do that, to accomplish that goal, is knowing ourselves. And some of you might be asking, Kirsten, what is this odd looking title thing at the top of this, of my slide? And for those of you who studied ancient Greece, or Greek rather, you'll probably recognize this as the famous saying, know thyself. Because this is the first step when we go on this quest for growth. Getting to know ourselves. It's as simple and as complicated as that. And we say that because on one hand, things seem so simple. But yet we are quite complex and we have so many layers to us. And we have a really good dear friend, and she always says, oh, but life is so simple. We complicate things. Indeed, we do. But I would finish that sentence by saying, life is so simple. We complicate things because we are complex individuals. We are complex souls that have been living so many lifetimes without bothering to open the door to who I am. I've been living in We might be living in this dark age, emotionally, psychologically speaking. And perhaps it's only in recent lifetimes that we've begun to start that quest for growth. Maybe we haven't even, opened the door. We're knocking on the door. Great job. You're at the door. Knock on it. Remember, Jesus said, knock and it shall open. So let us do that knocking. Let us take that first step. She goes on to say, your action and reaction express how you are on the inside, as well as how you really feel and see what is happening there. And this is so fascinating to us because it's, in a sense, kind of, dare we say, easy to read people on a base level when we simply can observe how one behaves. So if we observe how we react, our actions and our reactions, those are the thermometers for how we really feel and how we're really doing. People often use the term Freudian slip. Oh, that was a Freudian slip. I didn't mean to say that. I didn't mean to do that. Didn't we? You probably consciously did not mean to do that, but there was a part of you somewhere in there. There was a reason behind it. What that reason is for me and me alone to find out if I am the one. I'm the only one that can know myself the best and first, aside from God. That is my job, my responsibility. No one else can take that job for me. As much as someone can love you through and through, there's no replacement for the own work that we have to do. She goes on to say, therefore, do not waste your energies putting on masks. Instead, apply them to the ongoing work of self-improvement and inner growth until you exteriorize your achievements in friendliness, warmth, and love. And when Jesus said, blessed are the meek, these are one of the things he was referring to. Being friendly, warm, kind. We put a lot of energy into putting masks on, putting up walls. A lot of energy and thought, believe it or not, goes into that. And Joanna says, instead of putting all your energy there, shift and put that energy into working on our own self, on self-improvement and inner growth. That is the best investment we can make. Any attempt to change the world and make it spin as you see fit is a delusion. We do this so much. And it reminds me of a famous quote by Dr. Wayne Dyer. And he said, love people, not for what you want them to be, but as they are. Love people as they are, and not for what you want them to be. How many times have we done that to others? We want the world around us, and that includes people around us, to be as we see fit, instead of loving them for who they are. This too is a reflection of ourselves. That we may not have reached that level of self-acceptance yet. Self-compassion, self-love. You cannot love others because deep in your own inner world, in the inner workings, because you have not accepted yourself. And it's a delusion to think that we even attempt to change the world to make it the way that we want it to be. But Joanna says, but if you dedicate yourself to an inner transformation that is reflected in better behavior, you will reach the true goal of psychological maturity. The question is, and remains to be known, or rather I should say, Joanna drops this gem for us to think more, because the $1,000,000 question is, what does it look like for me to dedicate myself to inner transformation? What does that look like for me? It's going to look different for everyone. And what are those steps? Because it's going to be slightly different for each person and unique to our own needs. But how do I know if I'm dedicating myself? And you might say, Kirsten, well, how do I know if someone else is dedicating themselves to inner transformation? Well, I'm going to take it back to second grade. When my dear second grade teacher, God bless her soul, Mrs. Reese, she had this big sign above her door. And the sign said, MYOB, mind your own beeswax. And what that means, and it's not meant to be in a hurtful, in a derogatory sense, but it means mind your own mind. Mind your own inner world. Others are responsible for themselves. We are responsible for ourselves. So let us dedicate ourselves to this work of inner transformation. She goes on to say, with this deepening of your spiritual self, complete health will be your friend in the grand purpose that takes you in search of personal and human self-realization. Jesus never groveled before the falsely rich and powerful, nor was he ever arrogant toward the poor and the suffering. The line of balance between his inner and outer self demonstrated his moral, spiritual, and intellectual superiority, which makes him our model in every aspect, the perfect example of a fulfilling psychological maturity. We pause for us to contemplate these words. Jesus would have had every reason, in a sense, because he was superior intellectually, spiritually, morally, but he never had that need to display that to others. He was firm yet kind, loving, non-judgmental, and reminded us that we are loved and to come back to the right pathway. He never sought to divide people. Humans throughout history have done that. We have done that in our own immaturity. We have often taken his words and spoiled them through the lens of our own impurities, and still pay dearly for those things, trying hard to rectify the wrongs that we've made in his name. So let us take this moment, this opportunity, to paint this picture of Christ in a way that no one ever has before. Not the Jesus on a cross, although he was there and they put him there, but the Jesus that walks with us, the Jesus that was in the crowd of lepers, the Jesus that showed the different women of that time that they had value and worth, despite what others might have deemed them as, or whatever poor choices they may have made. He was the perfect example of what psychological maturity is. And that's why we call him our model and guide. Not because we have or we practice idolatry. It's for us to look to him, his behavior, his level of maturity and love, as a way to be, as a goal. Because when you study what Jesus did, how he was about freeing souls from themselves, from their own inner turmoils and darkness. When he said, "Go and sin no more," he was trying to free people from their own shackles, because he understood that being psychologically immature led them to those illnesses, to the wayside, if you will. And he's always there, just like he was with different disciples on the day they went out on the boat and a storm came and all the disciples were so fearful and scared. And then in the distance, they saw Jesus walking on the water. And one of the disciples begins to see Jesus and is calling out for him. And Jesus invites him out to the water. And he's eternally doing that. He's asking us to do the work. It's an invitation for each one of us. And it is a privilege. Our life is a privilege. Our existence is a privilege. And we end with this quote from Carl Gustav Jung. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you really are. And what we are children of God. Thank you all so much for listening and allowing us these moments to share these beautiful messages from Joanna, from Spiritism, and I hope that they've served some purpose. And I'll turn it back over to you, Leo.
Drink some water. Thank you for taking a deep breath. That was a lot of information. That was great. And only Joanna, right, to bring us to our senses this way, right? In a so eloquent way and so mature, for lack of better words, truly making sense in terms of how we need to grow in this area, right? How the dichotomy of feelings, right, can generate so much troubles for our life. But I would like to ask a question, but I'll leave to the end or perhaps in the middle of the questions because I'd like to give time for everybody to ask a question. Because of some technical difficulties, what I would like to do is to open for us here. We also have some comments online and questions, but I would like to start with those here. If you have any comments, any questions that you would like to ask, and I'll repeat to Kirsten here so she can hear it better in our audience as well online. Anyone would like to ask or comment anything? We have a quiet crowd here today. Okay, Daniel, if you
That's
can
okay.
help us then with the comments. I have some beautiful comments as well that we received, and what we'd like to ask you to comment on too, Kirsten. Paula says, "Be generous towards myself is such a beautifully comforting way to live." Thank you, Joanna.
Isn't it?
It goes along with what you just mentioned, right, Kirsten? Loving ourselves first, and I remember that she actually made this comment at the beginning of your discussion here that it's a reminder, right, to love ourselves before we try to love others, right, or invest on the idea of love others, which we should, obviously, as she reminds us at the beginning to serve others, right? That's a way for us to show that we love others. So it is definitely um, Paula there picking up on this idea of loving ourselves that you brought at the end. Abby says, "Great talk, Kirsten. I will still be a work in progress at." I know there is more to it. I think
She says, I'll still be a work in progress at age 80, always
it is.
being open to learn. And I love that, Abby. Me too. Me too. There's always so much to learn.
And then Paula says, "What practice benefit couples advancing their psychology maturity and staying in sync? Advice when one is advancing more than the other."
Oof. It's a
So we,
loaded
we got some
question,
excitement. We got
Paula.
Yeah, got some excitement here too, Kirsten. Everybody's like, "That's my question."
That's everybody's question, right? That we live in a world where primarily our issues are surrounding relationships, right? Of various different types. But I think this is probably a pretty common question and ask of a lot of people. And so I would like to answer it in a couple different ways. Kind of, for one, I would start by saying this. We know that the divorce rate at least in the U.S., I don't know outside of the U.S., is pretty high. I think it's about 50%, slightly over that. For first divorces and second marriages had even a higher divorce rate, and so forth goes on as the more marriages you have. Um, and in one of the books of Joanna, when she talks about marriage It might be After the Storm, or one of the other books in her psychological series. One of the things she mentions is that how, due to our immaturity, we get married for the wrong reasons, or we tie ourselves or enter into commitment with others for the wrong reasons. We are not psychologically mature. So, out of those, our immaturity, we end up creating this life with another person. And that's not to say that the answer is leaving, because once we've created a mess, the law of the universe that God created is, well, if you made the mess, you got to clean it up. So we would say, what practices would benefit couples in advancing their psychological maturity and staying in sync, and advice when one is advancing more than the other? I would say generally, you know, with, I guess, it varies, but some couples might find themselves on the same page with certain things, but not in other ways. And it could have varying degrees. But first and foremost, if a couple uh, needs to want to be on the same page, first and foremost, they both have to want that. And you might say, well, what if my partner doesn't want that? Okay, that's okay too. Ideally, be both of you, but if not, reality is that sometimes there are points in our lives where we may be wiser or more mature than our partner. So we must do our best. So much like Joanna was talking, and in other books, I believe it's in I think it's in Family Constellation, but by Joanna DeAngelis, I want to say. She gives this analogy of when we love our pets. And she says, okay, you have a cat and you love your cat, but the moment you start demanding that your cat rise to your level, it's insane. You cannot expect, although we do, our cat to be as we are, human, because they're a cat. So we must accept them as the cat that they are. We can love them as they are and do our best to do our part. So, but if a couple is on the same page and practice, and they want to practice psychological maturity, there's so many different ways to do that. I mean, nowadays there's a plethora. The self-help industry is is a $1 billion industry, and I'm not advocating for folks to go out there and spend tons of money, because Joanna DeAngelis's, and this is my personal plug, psychological series has a plethora, an abundance of knowledge and information and ways that suggest different practices, whether it's coming together, having a healthy practice together, such as going on walks, taking care of each other, and taking care of yourselves as individuals. Because it's hard to love one another if I'm struggling to love myself. So being on the same page and agreeing that we are going to both do that is a step in the right direction. And let me see, what was her question? Advice when advancing one more than the other. Yeah, so I think I answered the other part. Advice when one is advancing more than the other. Love is patient. Love is kind. It is incredibly difficult. It is to choose understanding and not get frustrated. But we have learned that when we get closer and closer to that level of psychological maturity, it's not as difficult because we understand. Well, that's their shortcoming. So that was a good question, Paula. So forgive my Leo. I don't know if you wanted to add to that at all, but
No, I have a follow-up question.
oh
And that is,
no.
I think it goes hand in hand with what we're saying here. Because one of the things that as I was thinking about it, as Joan Dion is bringing this idea to us, we obviously don't want to stay in the same level, or on the same on the other hand, we don't want to be overachievers, right? I think one of the issues that we find when we are in this quest of finding psychological maturity is to promise ourselves or to put ourselves in a situation that we become overachiever, and obviously we want to be something that perhaps we cannot be yet, and even years from now, as tied to what Abby said, when we get to be 80 years old, 90 years old, we're not going to be yet, right? Because it takes time. It takes a long time. So, what would you say in terms, and especially now that we're talking about, um, the life between two individuals, whether it is husband and wife, son and daughter, our parents sometimes as well. That what can we do when we get into this point that perhaps we look at ourselves being something that we cannot be yet? How how should we treat this idea, because we want to be great, right? We want to do great things, right? How to deal with that, especially when it comes down to in terms of relationship.
So let me see if I get this correct. So how does one manage unrealistic expectations that we place on ourselves?
Yes, we can start with that.
Okay. And also how to deal with that when we're putting unrealistic expectations on others or vice
No,
versa?
I would say on ourselves and how that um, may hinder or our relationships.
Oh, that's a good one. That Wow, that is really good. Yeah, I think that in and of itself is a revelation. If any one person were to come to that, because that in and of itself, being able to say to myself, "Man, I realize I have unrealistic expectations I put on myself, and that because I have unrealistic expectations for myself, that negatively impacts those around me." Because not only am I having those unrealistic expectations for myself, I'm doing that with others. And that is so hard if it's hard for you, it's even triple hard for those around us to try to live up to the high standards or expectations, unrealistic expectations. It's always good to want the best for others. There's nothing wrong with that, but there are extremes because we do not change overnight as much as we want to. And we can be diligent like Dwayne Johnson and, be ripped and, have amazing discipline. But the reality is that that takes decades to build that level of discipline and see results. So I would, one, be humble and set perhaps new goals for myself and be really forgiving of others, because I would want that in return, because we would need to ask for forgiveness from those around us whom we've put a lot of unrealistic expectations on. And we do this sometimes out of ignorance, out of, lack of, that psychological maturity. We're not bad people. We want to be better. We're super like excited about, evolving and like, oh my gosh, I love these great ideas and I want to be better, but then we get overzealous. And I'll use a more tangible example. It's kind of like people who get really into working out, and, in the beginning they become really crazy. And, we had a classmate like this, who we kept in touch with for years and years and years. And from the age of 16 up until now, I think he's almost 40, since he was 16. So you do the math, from 16 to almost 40, diligently been working out and eating healthy. But we can recall back when he and I were, of similar age, when he was neurotic about working out and telling everyone around him that they were horrible people, in essence. He didn't directly say that. But now, as he's getting into the old age of almost 40, oh my gosh, we could see how it's leveled off. He's reached that level of psychological maturity where he's doesn't try to push anyone else. He does what he needs to do. He eats healthy. When people ask him, "Hey, how do you stay so in shape? How do you like have all those muscles?" He said, "Well, I've been doing this for like a lot of years, several decades." So I think we reach a point when we have more understanding of our own selves, we can have understandings for others as well. And pray a lot for yourself.
No, that is definitely a great answer, and we're not alone. And when I say relationships as well, I should have mentioned on the question too, um, which is it goes along with another comment. I think it's Yasko who made it, that it is along with our brothers and sisters who are discarnated, right? We're
Yeah.
not alone. So everything is intensified, right? Whether it's coming from our side, our connections, as well as those who are living in the physical body with their connections. So great answer. Thank you for that. And definitely pray and ask for forgiveness. But Yasko says, "Hi, dear Kirsten. I wonder, during this alternate mood or behavior, how will the influence by spirits work out, considering the law of affinity?"
It happens much more than we realize and than what we are often even aware of, because the interactions with the spirit world and the ways in which these entities, which we are assuming are not of the best influence, the ways in which they are connecting to us is so um, is so unique that it's almost even difficult for us to perceive and think, oh, well, this isn't me. But it's so much a part of us that they become interwoven with us. Sort of like I am the socket, they are the plug. So it just feels like a natural fit. But all the while, their negative influence is having an effect on me. And oftentimes, as you say, it's maximizing the already difficulties I'm having by making it worse. Perhaps inflating my ego, inflating all of my vices, and just encouraging me to do everything that's opposite as good to me. So there's always that as well that we have to consider, that it's not just me and me, myself, and I, my own actions, but what I open up when I give myself over to negative behaviors or emotions or things of that nature. So it's always for something for us to think about. Thank you, Yasko, for bringing that into the conversation as well. I think that's an important piece.
Especially when Kirsten, when it we don't know. We spiritists, we have an idea. We have at least the knowledge that it happens, right? We have a connection. But there are many of us as well who, number one, we do not know, and we easily let ourselves be the situation become more acute, if we can, for lack of better words, um, and these feelings, the dichotomy of feelings, right? Grow exponentially. So it's definitely something that we need to watch for and pray for as well, and do our best. I think that's one of the reasons, again, that Joanna De Angelis at the beginning talks about the service, right? Serving others, right? Where is a great way for us to minimize these unfortunate connections, right?
Mhm.
I think we have one more comment. Yeah, Abby says again, great talk, Kirsten. I still be at work in progress at 80, always being open to learn. She has said, then I think we have one more, right? There's more comment. Thank you so much from Rob Campbell. And then Paula says, SUCH, such equals self awareness, understanding of others, communication skills, and healthy boundaries. Thank you, Kirsten, for supporting our psychological maturity. Wonderful talk. And if I may go back again, Daniel, real quick. And this is something that I was talking to a friend of mine. Really interesting. Talk about. I mean, we talked about self-awareness, the understanding of others, and communication skills. But one thing that I was actually talking to one of my friends is this idea of boundaries, right? That we often think that when we create boundaries, we will create enemies, right? Um, and it's really interesting the how we stay away from this idea of boundaries, right? On limitations, right? That we create for ourselves or create for others too. Um, and allow others to create their boundaries as well because they have their limitations, such as we do. So I don't know if you have on this idea of maturity, on if you can talk a little bit more, if you pick up or if you understood anything towards this idea of boundaries. And thank you, Paula, for the comment.
Yeah, thank you so much, Paul, for that comment. I love that. I'm going to use that SUCH,
Mhm.
self-awareness, understanding, communication, healthy boundaries. Healthy boundaries is not something we discuss enough. It's not, I would say maybe in recent years, it's become, I think maybe it's hit more mainstream media, if you will, about the need for and accepting boundaries. For sure, from a cultural aspect, the Latino culture is not giving of itself to boundaries. Some might say, coming from a family of Latin origin, but it is a necessity. And in any culture, we have um, differences, but it is vital that we learn healthy boundaries when we know, when Jesus said um, something like, oh gosh, I'm forgetting the actual phrase that he said, but something to the extent of, and someone help me out there, if I could have a lifeline. There's a time to say no, no, and yes, yes, or something to that effect. I can't remember the exact quote. But in essence, what he was saying is that we have to know when to say no and when to say yes. But only me, myself, and I know what that boundary needs to be. And that's, again, part of that self-discovery, knowing how to put that healthy boundary up and still be able to love others, but say, hey, this is, this is where we need to set this boundary. So definitely something to think about, maybe having discussions further from a spiritual perspective at a later time.
Thank you. And yes, and one of the things that I wanted to add too, I was looking for the actual. There's a book talking about self boundaries as well that I was going to actually mention here, but it just couldn't find it right now. That this friend, as we're speaking about it, she actually mentioned, which is a good read as well. Perhaps once I find it, we can put under the video as well, that we can always go back and learn more from it. And thank you for your comment, Daniel. Rosado says, thank you, Kirsten, beautiful and inspiring as always. And Vladimir, today's talk came as a very appropriate tool to consider in our thoughts and actions. Thank you, Kirsten. And Paula saying, great insight. My perfectionism gets projected onto others, creating a burden for them. More reason to release. We all do, Paula. We all do. Kirsten, do you have? I want to just give you a minute to, if you want to say anything, please do so.
No, just wanted to thank you all. Actually, was looking at that. I think our minds were connected, Leo, because I know that there's a book about boundaries as well. Well, I'll save for later. I was trying to search it real quick. Um, thank you all for your comments and sharing and giving us this opportunity to share these enlightening messages about psychological maturity. And I encourage and implore you, if you haven't already, to get this book of Joanna's, or any book from Joanna. Pick it up and start reading it and studying it. You'll be all the better for it.
Well, thank you, Kirsten, again. And with that, we'll conclude this moment. Wishing everyone well and hoping that everyone is safe. We would like to transition to the second part of our meeting, and thanking for all of those who are following us. And don't forget, please don't forget to push your like on there, share the video, make sure you share this message because it does happen for sure, helps us all grow as well. If we want to develop this maturity, psychological maturity, we definitely want others as well to do so, to help one another. So let us share. Thank you again, everyone. Until next time.